Right, and before Mark begins, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Mark. He teaches Latin and Ancient Greek at Glastonbury High School in Connecticut. He received his BA in Classics at UMass Amherst, his MAT in Latin and Classical Humanities at Boston University, and his PhD in Medieval Studies at University of Connecticut. He is a founding member of the Pericles Group, which provides game-based learning solutions for learners, teachers, and administrators in a wide range of situations and a variety of disciplines. And when he's not teaching or studying, he works on his farm, raising goats and making cheese, and very good cheese at that. We've been lucky enough to have some of it, and it's great. So, Mark, tell us about Culture Matters.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm looking forward to doing this. It's a little different format than I'm used to, so hopefully it will go pretty smoothly, but I'm sure that with Martha and Ginny in charge, that we're going to roll right through this beautifully. So I've called this Culture Matters because it was a little bit of a play on words here. I wanted to, on the one hand, talk a little bit about matters that have to do with culture and the way that they should be incorporated into teaching. But it's also, I'm trying to drive home the point that culture matters, that when we're teaching a language, it is essential that we also be teaching culture. And that is my goal to get that message across to you. So the objective sessions here, are you going to do the next slide?
Yeah,
great, thank you. The next the session objectives here are try to format good teaching with my can-do statements here that participants can understand and use the World Readiness Standards and the Culture Can-Do Standards to develop curriculum. So I'm not sure how many of you have had a chance to look at them, but if you haven't yet, I would really encourage you to go to the ACTFL website and look up the newest version of the World Readiness Standards, and especially the new set of can-do statements that have come out. One of the things that's different about them is that they do contain culture can-do statements, and I'm going to show you a little bit of the way that those are set up and talk about how we could work them into our curriculum when we're teaching with Cambridge. So that means that one of our goals is to make sure that we incorporate culture into curriculum development. A lot of us do that already. If we're using Cambridge, it's one of the reasons that you go to Cambridge, because it has such great cultural material in it. But I know that there are some people who struggle with how exactly you work the culture in, and that's part of what I'm going to address tonight. And finally, to create active language instruction activities that are based upon culture. So the first thing that I would ask you is to take a moment to think to yourself, why do you teach Latin and or Ancient Greek? I always include Ancient Greek since I teach it and always trying to promote there. So if you're a Latin teacher, then think to yourself, why is it that you teach Latin? What is your purpose? For a lot of us, it's that we love language, that we loved Latin when we were in school, that we want our students to have the same experiences that we do or did. But I think that we have to dig a little bit deeper there and actually think about what in this world, in this 21st century world that we're living in, with all the stuff that's happening in our country and around the world, what is the purpose for teaching Latin? And if you want to put some notes on the side, those of you who are here and feel like contributing, then that would be great. It's important, I think, always as a teacher to be reflective, to think about what you're doing all the time. Does your purpose change over time? Your technology has changed, certainly your methodology will change, but what about your goal? Do you still have that same goal, or do you have some other kind of goal? And I would even challenge you to think about, is there a purpose to teaching Latin and Ancient Greek today? Does it actually have a reason to be studied in the school systems? This is a problem that we're going to have to face. We've had to face it for well over a century, but it's not going away. And with the rise of STEM, I think that it's even more important for us to make sure that we are clear about what our purpose is, and that our purpose is not something as simple as to get higher scores on the SATs or something of that sort. That's really a gone by um, thought, and the truth is that it's not the truth. That isn't why we do it, and that's not what it does. So, what is your purpose? Is there a purpose? And what were you trained to teach? Were you trained to um, be a language teacher? Were you trained to actually teach culture? Were you taught the history that you're trying to do? There are all these different elements to the courses that we're teaching, and we have to think about whether or not the training that we had actually answers the purpose that we are trying to pursue now, and do we have to do some kind of work on our own to get better at that? And I would venture to say that the answer is yes in all instances, that we need to keep training, that we need to change the way that the way we teach so that it's not simply the way that we were taught, because we are not the students that we are standing in front of today.
And I would think that so many of us had been taught in a grammar translation way that some of it was in isolation in our brains, even if we loved what it was about and the Aeneid and all that. So our kids, even though they're not being taught in grammar translation, have the problem of life is very segmented out for them. So they definitely need people to connect the dots for them or help them to connect the dots.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, Ginny. And I was taught in a grammar translation method, and I loved Latin despite it. uh, the reality is, I loved grammar. I really did, and that was one of the things that attracted me to Latin. But what I found when I got to college, and even when I finished college, is that I actually couldn't read Latin when I was done.
Yes.
That, but then I went and spent some time in Spain, and after a couple of months, I was speaking Spanish and understanding Spanish far better than any Latin that I could. So that was one of the first things that challenged me to start thinking about my own learning and my own teaching style. So Cicero helps me with one of the the reasons that I'm teaching Latin, which we see here on the next slide. He says,
Let me say, we did get one answer. I don't, Martha, could you see it or not? It says, Franco says two purposes, anthropological and estetical. I can't speak today. He says, i.e., zeroing in on the other, the quirky, and therefore alluring aspects of ancient culture. This should help us become more respectful of the otherness that we see in our multicultural world. Also, oh, great, he wants me to say the same word I can't say. Because I don't know, I can't talk. Because of the beauty that Latin can have. It's time to go back to leverage the beauty.
and I think that's a really wonderful and good philosophical concept to have in the back of your head. I think you're going to find that your students would not tell you that that's why they're doing it at this point, and so that's going to lead me further along into talking about how we have to meet the kids at where they are, and the language that we use has to be language that they can understand. Um, I think that you're right, Franco, but I think that we have to get ourselves into our students' minds as we're going forward. So as the quotation from Cicero here says, "Nescire autem quid ante natasis accideret, id est semper esse puerum." Um, if we don't know what happened in our past, then we can never really be adult about the way that we look at our own lives in the future, since so much of who we are is shaped by what has happened before us. And that really is the cultural aspect of Latin. It it is not simply knowing the language, but rather understanding what the principles are that are behind it. And one could, of course, ask, well, why not just do that in a history class? Why not just do that through translation? But I think all language teachers would say enthusiastically that there's truth to the saying, it loses something in the translation. And I think that you don't really understand, you are unable to understand people unless you can understand them in their own language. And we can't truly understand the Romans until we can get our minds into the state that we understand their language in the way that they spoke it, not in the way that somebody else rendered it for us. into
Well, I think
English.
one's intimate. The other is someone telling you how it is or getting you through a lens. Whereas when you're in the language itself and you learn all the things about the language, it's a much more intimate understanding of what they're referring to. Yeah.
Yeah, and your mindset changes when you are in another language. Your mindset actually changes to adjust to that language, and so you start to take on a little bit more of that filter. Plus, we never really know how much we can trust the translator to have accurately represented the thought, right? I for one always want to know what it said in the original rather than looking at what somebody else said.
Yeah. Totally.
So um, that brings us then to the idea of communication, which is the center of all of the national standards on foreign language learning, or world readiness standards, as they're called now. And I think that this graphic, if you haven't seen it this way, is so important. It has here the 5 C's of the original standards: communities, cultures, connections, and comparisons. But then it also shows that at the center of all of them is communication. And it also divides communication up into the 3 modes: interpretive, presentational, and interpersonal. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those ideas per se, but I want to just make sure that we are continuously remembering that when we're talking about communication, we have this in the background. For us as Latin teachers or Latin and ancient Greek teachers, really where we're looking is at the interpretive place. We certainly can use presentational and interpersonal as ways of learning and practicing, but as an ultimate goal, since we're not going to encounter native Latin speakers today or come across communities where we are seeking to understand them through their language of Latin today, that it's really interpretive is the most important part of Latin or ancient Greek teachers' control of communication. So, what do we mean by communication? That's one of the important things to keep in mind. We can all say, oh yes, communication is the center for learning language, but until we understand exactly what that is, communication is, and I like this definition a lot, the process of expression, interpretation, and negotiation of meaning. So it means that you're not simply letting the words flow over you and they go through you and it's done. You actually have to be able to express yourself or listen to the way somebody's being expressing themselves. You have to be able to interpret what you're hearing or reading, and then you have to be able to negotiate that meaning so that you just have to decide, is this something that's straightforward? Is this something that has nuance to it? Am I reading between the lines? Um, what is the context in which it was said? All of those things come into play when we're reading and or communicating in general. And for us in reading, the harder part is we can't actually stop the author and say, could you explain that a little further? So it becomes very much an issue of interpretation at that point. So when we're teaching students to learn a language, we have to focus on that communication of information, on feelings, and on the ideas using the language, how they come through. And then we have to keep in mind that language use or communication is meaningful, it's creative, and spontaneous, right? It's not something authors will sit down and really craft what they're saying, but speakers and listeners don't really have that. That's where the the interpersonal mode comes in, is when you get to that point where it's so ingrained in you that you automatically and spontaneously can use the language or understand it without having to stop to do the work of translation. And then finally, I put on here comprehensible input, which is, of course, a major trend in teaching today. People are really talking about this a lot of times. I think that we need to understand comprehensible input as a theory of second language acquisition rather than as a methodology that can be employed in class. There are a lot of people out there who are trying to sell comprehensible input as if it were a package that you could use to make sure that your students are learning really well. but it's not. It's a theory that in order for students to learn, what they are learning must be understandable to them, or else they'll just ignore it or it'll wash over them. And it must be compelling so that they are excited about putting the time into understanding it as they move forward to grow in the use of the language. And this is one of the things that I think we can easily do when using the Cambridge Latin course because the stories are so compelling. As long as we can make sure that we introduce them in a way that keeps them comprehensible in terms of the vocabulary and word structures, the compelling part is already built in for us. And so we can be very successful employing and absolutely have to employ comprehensible input theory as we develop our lessons.
Absolutely.
So, as I mentioned, communication goal for Latin and Ancient Greek is reading. I'm not going to really dwell on that other than I kind of put this in just because I love this image that comes next, where it says she's reading, and in Latin, that's legit, which legit, of course, on the next slide. And really what I'm getting at here is that if we're going to teach students reading, then we ourselves must be teachers of reading.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where things fall apart for some of us because we were taught in the grammar translation method, and that was not teaching reading strategies. That was teaching translation. And translation is a slow and laborious task which actually takes you away from reading. Reading is staying in the target language and understanding what is in front of you. Translation is pulling yourself constantly out of it and trying to render it into something that is as close as possible grammatically, perhaps, to what you originally read. Although for other translators, it's less about being literal in terms of grammatical structures, but instead capturing the nuance of the words that were on the page. So we have to make sure that we are teaching reading and not simply translation. I say simply as if translation is an easy thing to do. I think that translation is one of the hardest things to do, and actually slows our students down a lot. So I do teach some translation as a way of checking grammatical understanding with my students, but as I've become a more and more veteran teacher, I've moved further and further away from it. On the next slide, I mentioned communicative competencies. I'm not going to go into this very much. They're here listed so that you can go and look them up on your own if you want to know about them. But the idea here is to simply say that when you're having a communication with somebody, there are all these different levels of competence that you need to maintain or attain to understand what's happening. And reading includes all of these things. So the one that we tend to get stuck on as Latin teachers is the linguistic competence, where we're looking at it and saying, okay, what form is this? Is this a subject? Is this an object? Does this show possession? Should this be in agreement with another word and so forth? But that's only one out of the 5 discourses that are here. The other ones include things like how are sentences linked together. That's not part of a grammatical thing. That's why do you put this sentence first, and why do you use a transition to move to this one, and how do we construct paragraphs? That's when we start to move into the idea of discourse competence. Why did you put the paragraphs in that order? How does that affect meaning? So reading has all of these things built into it. Strategic competence has to do with what you do when you get stuck. As a reader, we have to know how to maneuver a passage. We need to be able to skim it for knowledge first. We have to be able to look back and try to find deeper meaning later on, and so forth. So those are strategic competences. And the socio-cultural ones are the ones I'm getting at today, where you really, as the next slide says, you really cannot understand what you're reading if you can't understand what it's talking about, right? This is the idea of schema. Any classicist, any Latinist looking at this picture would see, oh, that's clearly Romulus and Remus, and they are being suckled by the she-wolf. Makes perfect sense to me. But if you were to take somebody who had never studied anything about Latin, it put that picture in front of them and said, "What's going on here?" They'd be kind of horrified. They would think, "Are you teaching bestiality in this class? What is going on? This is just wrong." We don't think twice about it because of the context that we know in what is familiar to us. So part of our job is to make sure that students have an understanding of the culture that they're approaching so that they are not either repelled by it or made to feel that they have no idea what's happening. And really, repelled is better than the latter, because when you're repelled, at least you could be interested. But if you look at it and you're reading and you have no idea what's happening, you quickly lose interest, you shut down, and you stop bothering, and then that means that you're not going to learn anything. So the idea is that culture is reflected by the context that we're studying, and that brings us to the question of what is culture. Um, Students love to take language classes because they always figure, oh look, we're gonna spend some time doing culture, and that for most of them means things like listening to music, eating food, maybe learning to dance or looking at the way that people dressed. In the modern realm, it tends to be watching movies or going to museums for all of us. And those things are all elements of culture, and they exist, as this image shows, as the tip of the iceberg of culture. But lurking below the surface of that, and really these are the kinds of things that you can only get when you're studying a language in the original, are the ways that people express um, their reaction to something that they see, the the deeper levels, the body language, the facial expressions. These are all our communication things. They're not going to show up in reading necessarily, but they're good examples of the way culture is happening under the surface. Um, so what we're going to see instead is the kinds of things that the choices of vocabulary that people use, and why does Catullus use certain vocabulary that you don't find in Cicero, for example? What's being reflected there? We're going to be able to see the way that things change over time. We're going to see the references that are made, the way that the Romans were very aware of their own history and made reference to themselves. We're going to look at when you're reading comedy, for example, why is it that the Romans are setting their comedies in Greece? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit down the road as well. So these kinds of attitudes come through at a much deeper level, and they are all part of culture, and they're all necessary for us to come to know if we're going to be able to understand what we're reading on the written page.
Such a great graphic.
Yeah, I know, I love that one.
It just really says so much more than you could ever even say.
Right, and that's the part that's, I do find frustrating, especially in the modern language classes, when they stay at that top level all the time. When you're, in my school, we teach Spanish from first grade on, and you think by the time you get to high school, you better not be having tacos as an example of what it means to study Spanish culture, right? When there's all that other stuff under the surface. In my district, they don't do that, I'll say. But those are the kinds of things that I want to be aware of. Is let's look below the surface to find out where the deep stuff is.
Right. One of the things I found as a teacher was that it made my department a little uncomfortable, the kind of topics I was discussing and teasing out with my students, like slavery, when they were doing Taco Tuesday. And I thought, well, your cultures have issues too, but they were like, oh no, it's got to be fun, but it doesn't really bring to the students the understanding and the relevancy that I think deep in their hearts they want.
Right. Yeah. There's that fine line between culture and stereotyping, and it's through a deep study of culture that we are able to overcome stereotypes.
Someone says here, same, especially, oops, I just lost it. When I think
Explaining Apuleius to my colleagues. Yeah, Apuleius will do that.
Good luck with that.
So on the next few slides, my friend Kevin Balestrini had put together in a presentation he was doing on on the can-do statements. And so I just, rather than reinventing the wheel, just borrowed those slides from him. So you'll notice his name's on them, but they're a little different color there. So one of the things that I make sure that I teach my students when we're studying culture is, we've got to start at a basic level. And so we look at what ACTFL refers to as the 3 Ps of culture, where you have products and practices down the bottom. And at the top, the higher level is perspectives. A lot of the products and practices are easy to spot on the top of the iceberg. The perspectives tend to linger lower below the surface, and they're much harder to get to. So when you're looking at family life in the Roman world, or the roles of women, and maybe certainly something like slavery or attitudes towards freedom, the way that entertainment, or even closer things like what was personal space like for a Roman. Um, when you look at things like the baths and the fact that they would go to the forum to do all of their business and so forth, it gives you a different insight into the mind of a Roman. And so I think that this graphic is really good for a start for anybody who's approaching culture for the first time. On the next few slides, you can see a little bit of what ACTFL has done with the can-do statements. And I'll not go through all of this now because you can read it later on since this is being filmed, but I do want you to notice that the way that they've divided it is in keeping with the proficiency scales that they have for the other forms of communication. So for interpersonal and presentational and interpretive, for example, where they talk about the novice, they talk about the intermediate, they talk about advanced, and moving upward towards superior and even distinguished. We really are only going to be dealing with the first 2 levels of novice, intermediate, and maybe into the advanced. The difference is that students are going to be far more capable of expressing cultural understanding in their native language than they are in the target language. And so this is one of the things that I will tend to give this kind of activity as an outside of class activity for them to think about and reflect on in English, and then bring that in to be able to tease out of it what we can in the target language. Because I'm trying to keep in my classroom, I try to stay in the target language as much as I possibly can, whether that's through speaking and listening, or in most often through reading, and then sometimes through writing. But you'll notice that the basic pattern here is that a novice can identify, an intermediate can make comparisons. We can start to do that really quickly with our students. By the time you get to advanced, you're trying to explain things, and that's much harder for students to be able to. You really have to have read a good amount before you can start to explain why the Romans did or thought certain things. And then the superior level, where you can suspend judgment while critically examining products and practices. Hopefully we'll be able to get students to move in that direction, but that's going to be that's a long shot. And linguistically, they're not going to get to that level anyway in our classes, because we simply don't have the number of seat hours to get them there. So if we can get them to, I would say, using the ACTFL scales, that we're really best planning to get to the upper levels of intermediate and lower levels of advanced with our students.
What I'm struck with is we use in here, they use explain as an advanced, and how many teachers put that on a test or a quiz as if it's a simple thing, and what they're really meaning is identify, because they're asking you to give back the information that they gave you.
Yes, exactly. And this is really when we're talking about explaining, we're talking about being able to explain what the perspective is behind the product in the practice, and that's much harder than just saying that it exists.
But what I like about the ACTFL standards across the board is they start with a very basic thing. I can list, I can identify, I can say a word, a phrase, so that people shouldn't be afraid of them, because I think they beautifully tell you if you get your kids here and then you move them here, eventually they will get here. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think they're a brilliant thing.
So moving on then to just show you what these look like in practice. Here are examples of novice ones. One of the really important things to keep in mind is that the can-do statements are not a checklist for you to say, here's my list of them. Once you can do all of these, I can say that you've mastered the novice level. That's not how it works. And there is no set list for a particular course or a particular language. It's really going to be up to you designing the curriculum to decide what are the things that fit into the bottom part of this. So in my own and other cultures, I can identify typical products. I can identify practices, typical practices. That's the indicator. The thing down below is what you have to write. And so for every unit that you're looking at, and I like to do it first for the entire year. I use the Wiggins Understanding by Design concept for my classes, and um, I will plot it out for the whole course that we're doing, and then plot it out according to smaller units as I'm moving forward from there. So just to give you an example, in my first year, our essential question for the year is who were the Romans? And so I know that when I'm talking about that, I'm going to have students looking for things like what is daily life, and I'll show you the question later on. But I just want you to have a sense as we're looking at this. So if I'm talking about daily life, I might have in my own and other culture, I can identify um, what people do during the course of the day, what kinds of jobs people have, and so I'm looking at the Cambridge text and I can say, all right, I can answer that question in stages 1 and 2, but I can also do it later on when we're looking at the forum, and I can also do it when I'm talking about the baths. Those standards are going to be met in it's not I'm covering this at one point and then I'm done with it. I am weaving this through my entire course, and that's one of the things that we're able to do. And when we look at readings in Cambridge, we'll see how that works. All right, so speaking of which, I'm talking too much for the amount of time that we have, so I'm going to move us forward a little bit faster. You can see that the difference is that when you get to the intermediate, you are doing compare rather than simply identify. Um, the intercultural reflection tool, which is on the next slide, talks about what I was saying, that you sometimes have to let them do these sorts of things in English. So one of the things I always have them do is write some kind of an essay at some point in English where I give them passages so I just did this on my midterm, which I just finished correcting today. I gave them 7 or 8 passages from the first book, and then asked them to answer the question, who are the Romans, based on the passages that were there. So their job was to look at the passages, which were all in Latin, be able to pick out some themes that ran through it. So they might do something like look at entertainment, or look at the sense of privacy that people have, or look at the roles of women. It was up to them to decide what 1 or 2 things for the Romans they were going to talk about in that particular analysis, and tie it to the text that they were reading in front of them. But they wrote in English when they were doing it. They cited the Latin as examples, but the actual expression was done in English because they don't have the skill to express themselves that deeply in Latin. All right, so that's what the next 2 slides about the intercultural reflection tool are, and you can think about that later on. So this brings us then to the question of how is it that we teach culture? As Donna Clementi says, if you lead with culture, language will follow. So what that means is that language itself is not going to be inherently interesting to most students, except for the weirdos like us who ended up as Latin teachers. People aren't going to come in and say, I really want to know about how subject and verb agreement, subject and verb relationship is. I want to know how dependent clauses are connected to primary clauses, and so forth. That's not what most students are interested in. They are interested in finding out about the culture. So if you bring the culture in and you make the connection between themselves, the students make the connection between themselves and the target culture, you're going to get instant buy-in. That's part of the magic of Cambridge, is that the stories do that for us really well. Narrative is a perfect way for students to learn. Humans by nature learn through narrative, um, but then providing them with characters that they also can connect to and feel a bond with as they move forward through the narrative and put them in cultural situations, they stop thinking about learning the language, which is really the goal. The language should be the secondary thing in their minds so that they can start naturally developing it. And then you can explain to them as you move forward what exactly is going on. All right. So Laura Terrell, I don't know if any of you are familiar with her. She is a modern language teacher, and she's brilliant in terms of her um, curriculum design. I borrowed a lot of this stuff from her, some of the stuff from the last slide, and this slide itself I took directly from her, where she shows that when you're developing a lesson or a unit, these are the elements that you need to have in it all the time, that it's communicatively purposeful, that it's culturally focused, that it's intrinsically interesting, that it's cognitively engaging, and that it's standards based. That sounds like a huge task, and it is. It takes a long time to do this. So you got to start small, do it with one unit first, do it with a lesson, just keep building up. But always remember, keep your eye on the end of where it is that you want to go, and the rest will follow. The reason this works, and I like the image, which I also took from Laura on the next slide, where if you keep the curriculum as a mirror for us to study ourselves, that's the part that intrigues students, especially when you're talking about middle and high school age students. They are very much into themselves because they are defining who they are against the world. So you give them something to look at and reflect on. And then you also use it as a window to help them grow by seeing the world beyond their own little room. They keep making those connections back and forth, and they come to understand themselves and they come to understand the world better. The fact that we're using Latin to do that is the same thing I was talking about with the Romans writing their comedy in Greece. It's too painful sometimes to look at yourself fully. You want to be able to recognize yourself in what you're seeing, but you don't necessarily want it to be just about you, because the world is bigger than you. And you can look at your own faults in somebody else, like a foreign culture, like the Romans did with the Greeks, and laugh at it, and then learn a lesson, take something away from it. Right? That's what Latin does for us. It lets us look at what's going on in their world and see how it influenced our world. Look at what's going on in their world and see how we changed it, maybe for the better, hopefully for the better. Look at what's going on in their world and compare it to what's happening in our country and see if we can understand how we can do a better job or how we can avoid the pitfalls that they fell into, and so forth, right? So always those two, back and forth with students.
Sorry, I jumped ahead.
Oh no, that's fine. That's where exactly I was going next, is that on the practical side, moving away from the philosophical, right? This is from Glisson and Donato's book, High Leverage Teaching Practices, which is available through ACTFL. They had this idea, the mnemonic of image, as a model for dealing with culture in teaching. So the idea is that you show an image, then you make an observation, or you have the students make an observation about it. Then you go back to the image and analyze it for more information to see whether or not the simple observation you made provides you with something deeper. From that, you can then generate a hypothesis about what's going on and dig into the perspectives based on what, if it's the first time you've seen an image of this sort, you're going to be saving that perspective and moving forward. If it's a series of things, you've looked at other images and you've already started to work on a hypothesis about perspective, it allows you to be able to say, oh yeah, I was right, or no, this changed. I have to change my theory a little bit in understanding what's going on. So this can be done with an image, as I'm going to show you in the next one, where this is, of course, very familiar to us. It's a picture of the the Pompeian Forum with Mount Vesuvius in the background, and the Temple of Jupiter right up there in the front. You can easily show this image to students and just start asking them, questions like these that I've given you in Latin there. And this is where, again, trying to stay in the target language as much as possible. Ubi est, quid vides, quis ad est, quid faciunt, right? You can ask them all of those questions. If they're very beginning, you can provide them with choices as examples. This is where the techniques that go along with CI are very useful. You can do circling kinds of things. You can do different. I've got to give you two different answers and let you pick which one's right. If you pick the wrong one, then I'm gonna tell you, oh no, that's not what it is. That's actually this, and then ask somebody else, and so forth. So there, you can get a lot of leverage out of it. There's lots of vocabulary in this picture. Depending on how deep you want to go in. If you want to talk about emperors, do you want to talk about slaves, do you want to talk about statues, you can do all of that kind of stuff, right? It's up to you and your students. They may ask what something is, and it's a great way, if they want to know what the word is, give them the word for it, because they're building their own vocabulary rather than simply learning it from an arbitrary list, or what to them seems like an arbitrary list. So a great starting point to do those kinds of things. But if we go on to the next picture, this is an overhead view of the town common, as we say in Massachusetts, or the town green, as we say in Connecticut, in Westford, Massachusetts, which is where I used to teach. And it's in some ways similar to a Roman Forum, and in some ways it's very different. So I can ask exactly the same kinds of questions. I'm starting to have students already do those intermediate cultural activities of compare and contrast when I start to do this sort of thing. So there's not necessarily anything that's different in this picture than the earlier one in terms of vocabulary. Some things are, but you can keep recycling the old vocabulary and keep practicing it, and it lets us to talk about what is a Roman Forum like, and whether or not we in cities today have that same kind of thing. I don't know, of course, where you're living. In a city, it might be much harder to find this kind of thing, but in the countryside in New England, every town has a common or a green. I know in New Mexico, for example, they would have a plaza that was the central one. So it really depends on where you are in the country, and that also affords us opportunities to talk about how we have different styles of town commons or gathering places depending on where we are in America.
Absolutely. A very interesting question to ask.
Yeah, and then moving on, this allows us to do these kinds of things for, if you're interested and really want to try to make sure you get all of the modalities in, which I do like to try to do whenever possible. Of course, I stay in the interpretive most frequently, but you can create activities where students are doing things like comparing and contrasting things from the ancient world and things in the modern world, and have them read, look at a picture, do some research, get up in front of the class and present what they found. Again, try to do this in the target language rather than trying to do it in English. Have them ask one another questions about it. You can have one of them have the Roman picture, and one have the modern picture, and they can ask back and forth, and it can be as complex or as simple as you want. Do you see blank in Pictura? Do you see, you can ask them those kinds of things if they're at a very basic level. But the thing that makes it more interpersonal is they don't know what question they're going to be asked. They have to be ready to answer whatever the question is. So it's not simply an interpretive thing; it's an interpersonal thing. So that's a very basic way to start an IDA when in working with students, but I think it's good to get them started early on, so you can do more complex ones moving forward. Um, for us, since reading is mostly what we're doing, one of the things that I would say is you can use a text exactly the same way that you can use an image. So you can put it up there on the screen, you can read it dramatically, you can act it out, you can have students make observations about what they got from reading the text or listening to the text. You can ask them to analyze it for more information, right? So these are the same things, the image um, idea that Glisson and Donato mentioned from before. You can have them generate a hypothesis based on it, and you can explore for products, practices, and perspectives. So um,
So my kids had a hypothesis that the dirty togas were deliberate so that they would go inside and spend money on the more splendid togas.
yeah, absolutely. That's a great thing for them to think about. And you know, why would they do that? Do people do that kind of thing today? Well, how would you react? You can That's where you can start getting some of the personalization in, and these can be questions that are asked in Latin as well as in English. So I'm going to show you now what the essential question is, and I do introduce the essential question to them in Latin when we go over it. So these are the types of things that we're trying to study in the first year of, this really is the question that goes along with the first unit. So Unit 1, we ask who were the Romans, using the Pompeians as a model. In Unit 2, we then ask what happens when cultures meet. And the reason that we do that is we see Quintus first in Roman Britain, then in Roman Alexandria, and it really gives us a sense of what it means to be a Roman traveling around in the world. And it's a question that's very relevant to them in the modern world. But so these are the types of things we're looking at in the first year: daily life, as I mentioned before, food, family, clothing, education. We're looking at the government, we're looking at religion, we're looking at leisure and entertainment, all of these different things that are listed here, right? I point that out because if we go back to that same text that we were just looking at a moment ago, on the next slide, you can see that I can answer or get them to answer part of the question of who were the Romans. And this is the kind of thing I'm trying to get them to write about in English when they took their midterm today. Is in this one little passage here, we see commerce, things like bartering and haggling when you're buying stuff. We see clothing being described because there are togas that are mentioned and there are stolas that are mentioned. And so you have men and women both shopping there. You see social class, and this is really important. This idea of the role of the master and slave and the concept of social class plays out so well in this story, where Metella comes and she has Melissa with her, and it's Melissa who does most of the bargaining with Marcellus, not Metella herself. She's not going to get into this kind of an argument over the cost of something when she's got a slave to do it for her, but it is Metella who makes the final decision. You know, Melissa, who is not of the same social class as Metella, is in there calling him a Ferkafer and, you know, yelling at him and saying how dirty the togas are or so forth. Metella's response is, "You demand too much. I offer you 30." You know, it's a much more staid, elevated kind of role, and Marcellus immediately agrees with her. He doesn't get into a fight with the domina, with the matron, in the same way that he does with the slave. So all of that can be teased out of a passage like this, which, if you don't bother to do that, it's an opportunity lost in reading this kind of thing.
Take the story as seriously as you take the language structures or the grammar.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you do that, if you approach from a cultural context, then you are able to incorporate all three modes in the way that you approach this. You're able to ask questions in Latin after you've gotten them to interpret some of this. You can get them to play roles, have them bargain with one another, and then you don't know whether or not you don't know how much somebody's going to ask or how they're going to react when you give a certain price or something of that sort. So there are lots of different ways that you can approach this and get the different modes of communication in there.
Definitely.
Moving on to the next slide, I mentioned that in the second year class, we talk about what happens when cultures meet. And here we see this is such a great passage where Clemens has his shop in Alexandria, and Quintus wants to go and visit him. So he brings his new slave that was given to him. His slave is an Egyptian boy. Barbillas had given him a slave, and they're walking through the streets, and they come across this crowd, and in the crowd there is an old man who's scolding or yelling about the Romans and the Greeks, and they see that there aren't any Greeks around at all. It's just the Egyptians that are here. And the slave says, I think we better go back to Barbillas's house. It's not safe to be here. And Quintus says, no, I know the Egyptians are mad, but I don't want to go back to the house. We've already made a long journey. This is such a perfect example of a person who is in over his head. Quintus does not understand the culture that he's in.
He's used to saying, "This is what I want. Let me have it."
Exactly. He's a privileged Roman who is used to always being treated with respect and never having to worry about being questioned or attacked or and really, if you want to get into things like the concept of what it means to be privileged in a society, this is a perfect place to do it. And I think that, like we saw in the other passage, there's so much that's here. You just have to make sure that you're designing your lesson not around the use of the genitive, which is what you do in stage 17. You don't want it all to be about ex hoc parte urbis. Look, that there's a genitive there, but rather that, what is the perspective of the crowd of the Egyptians here? What do you think the slave boy must be thinking? How would he be dealing with this? And why does Quintus react to the way that he does? This is where you're getting to the perspectives below the surface.
And we always noted that the Egyptian slave boy was trying to watch out for the safety of Quintus, and Quintus, in return, doesn't seem to have regard for anybody's safety, including his own. But he doesn't get it, as you said.
Yeah, that's the naivete, really, that comes along with his privilege.
It's such a good story. You're absolutely right.
In the next one, just looking at the time, we're getting really short here. So I'm not going to talk about this much, but this is another suggestion. We deal with the idea of identity in the next level, which is when we come across the story. So we're trying to talk about the role of religion and what it means to be a citizen and social classes, all of those things, the idea of marriage, and again, there's so much that's there. You can read the question, and if you have any, if you want to talk more about it, feel free to get in touch with me. One of the things going on to the next that I'd really point out is that a lot of people think that, oh, I'm going to try to introduce culture by doing projects in my class. I used to do projects, and I've really gotten away from the idea of projects, and that's what this is dealing with, the idea of a Grecian urn. It's a funny article that's there if you want to read it, where this evaluator talks about how he or she watched this teacher do this whole lesson on Grecian urns and had students making them out of paper mache. And after they spent 4 or 5 days making them, the question was, how did that actually help you learn any language? Right? There's no language learning going on while you're doing that kind of thing. And so the thing you want to do is avoid making your lesson into a Grecian urn where you spend all of your time working on this tangential thing that actually isn't productive to what your end goal is. So the solution then is avoid projects, but instead do tasks. Tasks are the kinds of things where you get students to do things, but you have them do them in the target language. So that could be something like a cooking activity where you have them mixing foods together, and you give them the ingredients and recipe and all of that in Latin, and they have to question one another. Or it could be where you give them a mystery that they have to ask questions of one another to solve the mystery or something. But in a task, the important thing is that the goal is not to learn a grammatical structure, it is to learn some other thing. So You could do something using education, for example, in stage 10, where you give them a picture like this and you ask them to, you know, what do they see in there? What can they name in Latin? What do they think is going on? Who's sitting in the chair? Who's the person standing behind the guy sitting in the chair? What's the difference between the two people who are seated? Who do you think is which one? So there's a lot going on, and you could have them do a task of trying to solve the mystery of who's in the picture by reading a story about it, by discussing it, asking one another questions in Latin, writing about what they see and what they've discovered. And so there you get lots of use of language, and they're not going to know something like Pythagoras, but they will know Serwis, and you can teach them Pythagoras as they're going along as part of what's happening. Or they could have read it in the culture section at the end and then had to apply it to the picture as they're looking at it. So this can be a very short kind of task, or you can extend it over a length of time depending on how far you want to go. The next slide is really something that has more to do with the gaming that I do, and we're down to 2 minutes, so I'm just going to skip right back down to the last slide, leaving us with the question of Quo Vadis, where do you go from here? If we were in a group, I would have you discuss this with one another, but really, I would love you to share with me if you want to either write things here now or send things along to me. Share what you do, what you're going to do with this new learning. Ask me questions if you have, or you can communicate with Ginny and Martha, and they can get in touch with me just as easily. Whatever's most comfortable for you. I hope that I've given you some provocative things to think about, have helped you to stop and think a little bit more about the way that you can integrate culture. And if you want me to do more later on, just let them know, and I can
Absolutely.
certainly
Mark,
be more concrete.
I do want you to say one thing about this. So why was this so important to you, this idea of, because people think of games again as a way to kind of use time up, sort of.
Yeah, I think the thing is that games, they're the idea of gamification is that students are going to be enjoying what's going on in a game, and so they forget that they're learning. That's actually the concept of a task, is that they get caught up in the learning and they forget, because they're trying to perform a task, they forget what they're doing. So what we set out to do was try to come up with an idea that if you turn learning into a game, then the idea of what you're trying to accomplish is really the end point. It's
Right.
not that I'm going to teach you how to play Kahoot and then you're going to learn a lot from Kahoot, because you're not really.
Right.
All you're going to do is learn some words, and the part that students love is the fact that they're playing a game. The learning how to play a game does not actually help them with anything.
No,
But if you can somehow or another make your classroom a game where the object is to learn Latin, then that changes. You're not imposing game-like elements. You're turning your teaching into the fun of learning, and that's really the central
and that's
goal.
something I think I personally have always had so much fun with my kids. So that's why I've always loved that you guys did this.
Yeah,
Well, thank
yeah,
you.
very well said. Yeah, Mark, that was really terrific. The way you combined, a little bit of the theory, and then brought in those world readiness standards, and then really specific practical examples that teachers can incorporate in their classes. And as Mark said, he hopes that you'll get in touch with him if you have additional questions. And again, if you need a certificate, do email us at CLC Training. And thank you everyone for participating this evening.